Steve, how are you? I haven't seen you for a couple of years, but it's lovely to see you again and to welcome you to this third podcast of ours, which is the series Greg Goes Global. Delighted to have you along, and we're hoping that you'll give us a bit of an insight into Canada and what's happening there. I know you're an expert there, and you've been working there for a long time. So could you maybe begin, Steve, by tell us a bit about yourself, about your work, and how did you get involved in housing?
Sure, happy to do that, Paddy, and it's good to see you again. Yeah, despite the accent, I I moved here when I was 16, but I kept the accent, but I do claim to be Canadian. The the starting point for me was really at an undergrad in university. I think third or fourth year there was a directed studies course. The prof that year just chose to housing was the theme, and that kind of got me hooked. And I just got interested in it, and then ended up going to grad school. And my thesis was in the housing finance area, and then ended up working in the non-profit co-op sector, doing development work for a couple of years, and then joined our national housing agency, CMHC, with various positions, which was a really good learning experience, from housing market analyst to social housing program coordination kind of stuff, and then ultimately spent 5 years here at the national office in Ottawa, running a sort of a long-range policy think tank for them, before I got tired of bureaucracy and decided to hang up my shingle as a consultant.
Okay, and of course, what has made you stay then? Just the same reasons, yeah.
Yeah, it's an area, you could be a big fish in a little sea, I suppose, and it's it's an area it's always been very interesting. It's and as a consultant too, I get to do different things all the time. I'm not doing the same old all the time. So there's a lot of diversity, interesting stuff. Over the years, as you know, I've got more involved in sort of comparative international research. So it's always interesting to sort of see what's going on in other places and what's the policy transferability kind of stuff. So yeah, as long as it's interesting and exciting, it's kept me here.
Brilliant, yeah, thank you for that. I suppose moving on to professionalism, we here we have the Chartered Institute of Housing, and which I've been involved in for a long time, and I know really it hasn't established very much in Canada, but just the whole notion around professionalism. Do you think it's important? Do you think that it's important that people have certain standards in the housing world?
Yeah, I mean, there are two sort of sides to that. I mean, the context in Canada is that we have quite a small sector. We're only about 4% of total housing stock. And so it's not a big employment base like it would be, for example, in the UK. And there isn't a tradition of vocational training in the way that you would have there as well. Having said that, our sector, as it evolved from a public housing sector, like your council housing sector in the sort of the 50s and 60s into the 70s, moved to a community-based non-profit sector. But we decided that large-scale public corporations and bureaucracies were bad because they were creating ghettos of poverty, and small-scale community-based is good. The long-term consequence of that is we have a sector that's dominated by a lot of very small providers. Ontario, for example, has over 800 social housing providers. 700 of them have less than 100 homes. Only about 20 have more than 500 homes. So as we think about the sector, how we actually become more self-sustaining, and now we've got properties that are 40, 50 years old, debt-free, and the opportunities are there to leverage the assets. Having the right skill sets to leverage the assets is critically important. I think that's where professionalism comes in, more so than the tenant services side. I mean, small is good in terms of good relationships with tenants. You don't have the same level of sophistication, a smart CFO, chief development officer kind of stuff. When you've only got a portfolio of 100 units, you've got basically a bookkeeper and a janitor. You don't have that staffing. So I think as we think about the future, we need to think about, yes, we need to be more professional, but to be professional, we also need to think about scaling up the sector and some consolidation and an aggregation of these very small providers. Take 10, 50 unit providers and make a one provider with 500 units. Then you could start thinking about, okay, what kind of staffing do we need, and what kind of support do we need to ensure that they actually are more professional than the sort of the mom and pop type providers that we have right now.
Okay. Well, since you and I last met, Steve, things have changed in the world, and we've had COVID-19, we've had the lockdowns associated with that, and the economic sort of, the impact it's had on economies around the world, and of course we've got the Ukraine war, which is also affecting supply chains, affecting the economy. So I'm just wondering, in Canada, what do you think are the major policy issues that are facing practitioners today, given what's happened over the last few years?
Yeah, I mean, I think the issues have been more on the market side than on the sort of social housing practitioner side. But in terms, certainly, the dramatic decline in interest rates, which resulted in very, very significant increases in home prices, not just in Toronto and Vancouver, but across the country. Home prices went up, more or less 20% a year for 2 years in a row. So all of a sudden, issues of ownership affordability became a significant concern associated with that. Various analysts and indeed politicians pointed their finger to the lack of supply being the problem, as opposed to the fact that it was actually more on the demand side. It was driven by those very low interest rates and people getting in there. So prices went up massively, and also that transferred into the property market generally and asset values in the rental sector. And I think it's really exacerbated the issue of financialization and large capital funds buying existing property assets, because again, the characteristics of our private rented sector is one of multi-residential buildings owned by larger landlords and well, some small and large landlords, and so they'll buy 200 units, 300 units at a time. So these large firms are coming in there, buying the existing properties precisely for the purpose of generating yield. And given our rent regulation and legislation in this area, they have opportunities to actually get rid of the tenants and increase the rents. And so that's really rapidly eroding the low rent stock. Between 2011 2016, we lost over 320,000 units, in which is 10% of our rental stock, renting below $750 a month. We didn't lose them, but they moved up market. So there's a very insufficient stock of low rent units. So folks trying to exit homelessness, there's nowhere to go. The problem for there's increasing demand for the social housing stock, and folks in there are not moving out because there's nowhere to go to. So we've got a stalling there in terms of utilizing that very important resource, but small resource of social housing to allow new folks in there. If no one's moving out, there's barriers to entry in there, and we just have an insufficient supply. And even though we developed a national housing strategy in 2017 with a goal of reducing housing need and ending chronic homelessness, it really hasn't produced at the level that's necessary either to meet sort of persisting need or to offset this erosion kind of issue. So I think that's a pretty serious issue in the market that's now bumping over. If young households can't access the ownership part of the market, mainly because of high prices, but also some macro-prudential policy constraints as well. They're staying in the rental sector. That's increasing pressures on the rental market, pushing up rents, and that bumps down to the bottom end of the rental market and it significantly impacts affordability issues down there. So the housing system isn't working very well in terms of sort of meeting that full continuum of needs across the consumer sector and the needs sector.
No, that's fantastic, Stephen. Thanks for that insight. Obviously when I mentioned practitioners, I didn't mean policymakers as well, which you rightly addressed. Thanks for that. Just moving back now, just to finish off to the Steve Pomeroy himself and the man. And outside of housing, how do you relax? And tell me something interesting that's not on your CV. Two very simple questions.
Yes. I like to. I've always had a pretty active lifestyle, and in a lot of different sports, that kind of stuff. But of course, we get older. I mean, to play soccer or football, as you would call it. The body's not holding up so well. But I do enjoy cycling, and I do enjoy playing golf. And so I, a couple of years ago, jumped on my bike and cycled to New York City, right into downtown New York on my bike, 700 kilometers in a week.
Seriously, that's fantastic. Brilliant. And what about your CV then? Tell us something that's not on it that you'd like to share with us.
Yeah, it's hard to say. It's a pretty comprehensive CV. But yeah, I mean, obviously the personal side of things, right? I mean, the fact that I got a couple of kids. Well, I got 3 kids. My daughter actually sitting around a table with Duncan McLennan and I as we were talking housing policy issues. She says one day, "Oh, this stuff's really interesting. I think I'm going to go and get a degree in urban land economics. Where shall I go?" And so anyway, make a long story short, she ended up in Australia and is now the chief policy officer for the Community Housing Industry Association in Melbourne. So I'm contributing to the next generation of us, Paddy.
That's fantastic. That's brilliant, Steve. And I'm glad you mentioned our old friend Duncan McLennan as well. I was chatting to Duncan recently, actually. So, but Steve, that's been fantastic. Thank you very much. Sorry I had to whiz through quickly, but you know, I'm sure we'll get a longer conversation, maybe in Barcelona at the end of the month.
I look forward to that. Yeah.